When we picture an astronaut, our minds tend to conjure a familiar image, a figure clad in a brilliant white suit, a mirrored visor reflecting the vast, silent darkness of space and the gentle blue curve of the Earth below. We think of human heroes, figures like Yuri Gagarin, Alan Shepard, and Neil Armstrong, who took the first tentative, then giant, leaps into the cosmos. But before any human being dared to breach the fragile veil of our atmosphere, that iconic suit was filled, metaphorically, by a different kind of pioneer. They were the unsung astronauts, the silent voyagers whose small heartbeats in the void answered the most critical and terrifying question of the mid-20th century. Could a living creature, evolved over millions of years in the warm embrace of Earth's gravity, actually survive the brutal journey into space? Before engineers could truly dream of sending men to the moon, they had to know if the violent, rattling ascent, the disorienting abyss of weightlessness, and the searing heat of re-entry were survivable for a complex biological organism. This fundamental question launched a global effort, a silent space race that preceded the one we all know. It's a story that spans the globe, and we'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Drop a comment to let us know, and be sure to subscribe so you're notified of our future stories. These first explorers were not human. They were fruit flies, monkeys, dogs, and cats, a veritable ark sailing into the unknown. Their missions, often tragic, were the essential first steps, the invaluable sacrifices made on the altar of human ambition, paving the way for the cosmic age from the rubble of the Second World War. The ashes of that global conflict were still warm when the seeds of the space age began to sprout, not in pristine laboratories, but in the harsh, sun-scorched desert of New Mexico. The end of the Second World War had triggered a frantic scramble, a new kind of battle waged not with armies, but with intelligence officers and engineers. The prize was Germany's advanced weaponry, and the crown jewel was the fearsome Vergeltungswaffe II, or Vengeance Weapon II. This was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a creation of terrifying genius that had arched silently across the English Channel to deliver destruction upon London and Antwerp. Its creator, the brilliant and controversial Wernher von Braun, along with his team of top engineers, had surrendered to the Americans, and with them came the secrets of their creation. Under a classified program that would later be known as Operation Paperclip, these former enemies of the state were brought to the United States, their pasts scrubbed in exchange for their knowledge. They were settled at Fort Bliss, Texas, and tasked with reassembling and improving the very rockets they had designed for the Third Reich. Out at the newly established White Sands Proving Ground, a vast expanse of gypsum, sand, and scrubland in New Mexico, a stockpile of over 100 captured V-2 rockets awaited a new purpose. The weapon of war was about to become a chariot of science. American scientists, now armed with a vehicle that could punch through the sky to heights previously unimaginable, saw a unique opportunity. The upper atmosphere was a complete mystery, a frontier as unknown as the depths of the ocean. They wanted to study atmospheric pressure, temperature, and, most critically, the nature of cosmic radiation. Physicists had long known that Earth was constantly bombarded by high-energy particles from deep space, but the planet's thick blanket of air absorbed most of them. What would happen to a living thing beyond this protective shield? The V2 could travel to an altitude of over 160 kilometers, well over 100 miles, placing it firmly in the thermosphere, far above the protective ozone layer. The concern was that this unfiltered radiation could be instantly lethal, or worse, that it could cause horrific mutations in the genetic code of any organism exposed to it. Before any thought could be given to sending a human into that environment, this question had to be answered. The scientific community needed a biological passenger, a proxy to brave this unknown danger. They needed an organism that was small, required little life support, and, most importantly, was so well understood that any changes, no matter how subtle, would be immediately apparent to researchers back on Earth. The choice fell upon a creature familiar to anyone who has ever left fruit on a kitchen counter for too long: the common fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster. The humble fruit fly was, in many ways, the perfect candidate. It was far from being just a simple pest. For decades, it had been a cornerstone of genetic research. Scientists like Hermann Joseph Müller, who had won a Nobel Prize in 1946 for his work showing that X-rays could induce mutations, had mapped the fruit fly's genetic makeup with incredible precision. They knew its 4 pairs of chromosomes like the back of their hand. This intimate familiarity meant that if cosmic rays were to alter even a single gene, they would be able to detect it. Furthermore, the fruit fly's life cycle is incredibly rapid. A new generation can be produced in about 10 days. This allowed researchers to not only examine the flies that flew into space, but to also study their descendants for many generations, searching for any hidden damage that might not appear immediately. They were also remarkably hardy, capable of withstanding the extreme acceleration and vibration that came with sitting atop what was essentially a controlled explosion. So, on the 20th of February 1947, inside the nose cone of the V2 rocket, designated as number 20, a small aluminum canister containing a precious cargo of fruit flies was prepared for launch. The mission was simple in its goal, yet profound in its implications: to carry the first living creatures from Earth into space and, hopefully, bring them back alive. As the countdown reached 0, the desert air was shattered by the deafening roar of the rocket's engine, igniting 34,000 kilograms, or 75,000 pounds, of thrust by burning a volatile mixture of liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol. The sleek, black and white painted missile, standing over 14 meters or 46 feet tall, rose from its launch pad, slowly at first. Then, with astonishing speed, it tore through the sound barrier in under a minute, a thunderous crack echoing across the plains as it climbed into the thinning blue sky. On board, the fruit flies were pinned by forces many times that of normal gravity, their tiny bodies enduring the same stresses that future human astronauts would one day have to face. The rocket continued its ascent, coasting on momentum after its engine burned out 65 seconds into the flight. It soared past the Armstrong limit, an altitude of around 19 kilometers or 12 miles, where human blood would boil without a pressurized suit. It continued upwards, through the stratosphere, and into the ionosphere. Then, for a few precious minutes, it crossed a silent, invisible threshold. At an altitude of 109 kilometers, nearly 68 miles above the New Mexico desert, the rocket and its living cargo had officially entered space, crossing the internationally recognized boundary known as the Kármán line. These tiny insects, unknowingly, became Earth's first true space travelers. After reaching the apex of its journey, the rocket began its long fall back to Earth. The mission's success now hinged entirely on the recovery. The nose cone was designed to separate from the main body of the rocket, which would plummet to the ground and be obliterated on impact. A parachute system was built into the payload capsule, intended to deploy and gently lower its precious scientific contents back to the surface. For the anxious recovery team on the ground, it was a tense wait. They scanned the skies, searching for the telltale sign of the orange and white parachute against the vast blue. Finally, it was spotted. The capsule drifted down and landed softly in the desert sands, miles from the launch site. The team raced to the location in jeeps, their greatest fear being that the capsule was breached or that the inhabitants had not survived the ordeal. With great care, they retrieved the canister and transported it back to the laboratory. When they opened it, they were met with a sight of profound relief and triumph. The fruit flies were not only alive, they were buzzing, completely unharmed by their extraordinary voyage. Subsequent analysis of their chromosomes and those of their many descendants revealed no discernible increase in mutations compared to a control group that had remained on the ground. The first great fear of spaceflight had been addressed. A living organism could be launched into space, be exposed to the cosmic rays found there, and return to Earth seemingly unscathed. This tiny success, achieved with insects aboard a repurposed weapon of terror, was a monumental first step. It answered the first, most basic question, but it immediately gave rise to a new, more complex one. If a simple insect could survive the journey, what about a creature more like us? A vertebrate, a mammal, a primate? The path to sending a human into the stars was now clear, but it would be paved with the lives of many more animal pioneers. The path was indeed paved with pioneers, and the next steps were taken not by insects, but by creatures whose biology mirrored our own with startling fidelity. At Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, not far from the White Sands launch site, a new kind of airman was being recruited. These were rhesus monkeys, small primates native to Asia, chosen for their intelligence, their physiological similarity to humans, and their relatively calm disposition. Scientists at the Aero Medical Laboratory, under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel John Stapp, a pioneering flight surgeon, believed that data from a primate in space would be infinitely more valuable than that from an insect. A monkey's cardiovascular and nervous systems were a close analog to a human's. If a monkey could withstand the crushing acceleration of launch and the strange new state of weightlessness, there was a very real chance a human could too. And so, in the late 1940s, a series of missions was planned, each one carrying a monkey who, for the sake of anonymity, and perhaps to soften the emotional blow of the expected losses, was simply given the name Albert. The first of these primate astronauts, Albert I, was prepared for his mission on the 11th of June, 1948. He was a rhesus monkey weighing about 4 kilograms, or 9 pounds. Anesthetized and fitted with sensors to monitor his vital signs, he was carefully placed into a cramped capsule in the nose cone of a V-2 rocket. The goal was for him to reach an altitude of over 60 kilometers, or about 37 miles. But Albert I never came close to the edge of space. The rocket performed flawlessly, but the confined space of his capsule and a failure in his life support system proved fatal. He suffocated before the rocket even cleared the launch tower, his mission a tragic failure that highlighted the immense engineering challenges that lay ahead. It was not enough to simply launch a creature skyward. They had to be kept alive within their tiny, isolated world. Undeterred, the team learned from their mistakes and prepared their next mission with a renewed focus on life support and instrumentation. Just over a year later, on the 14th of June, 1949, it was the turn of Albert II. He too was a rhesus monkey, and his flight would prove to be a landmark achievement. Secured in his capsule atop another V-2 rocket, he was launched into the clear desert sky. This time, everything worked as it should. The rocket roared to life, pushing Albert II faster and higher than any complex living organism had ever gone before. His capsule was equipped with telemetry equipment that broadcast his physiological data back to the anxious scientists on the ground. They watched their instruments with bated breath as the monkey's respiration and heart rate climbed during the violent ascent. Then, as the engine cut out and the rocket coasted upwards, they saw the data that proved their theory. The monkey's body was functioning properly in the zero-gravity environment. Albert II soared to an altitude of 134 kilometers, or 83 miles, well beyond the Kármán line. He had officially become the first primate and the first mammal to travel into space. He had survived the launch and the exposure to the space environment. For a few brief minutes, a creature from Earth with a heart, lungs, and a brain much like our own was a true astronaut, a silent voyager in the void. Now came the most critical part of the mission, bringing him home. As the capsule plunged back into the atmosphere, a parachute system was supposed to deploy, slowing its descent for a soft landing. But something went terribly wrong. The parachute failed to open. Albert II, the first monkey in space, who had survived the rigors of the journey, died instantly on impact as his capsule slammed into the New Mexico desert at hundreds of kilometers per hour. The tragic loss of Albert II set a grim precedent for the missions that followed. The problem, it seemed, was not whether a living being could survive in space, but whether American engineering could build a machine reliable enough to bring them back. The string of failures continued to mount. Just 3 months later, in September of 1949, Albert III, another rhesus monkey, was launched. His V-2 rocket suffered a catastrophic failure just 10 kilometers, or 6 miles, up, exploding in a fireball that obliterated the monkey and his capsule. 3 months after that, in December, it was the turn of Albert IV. His mission was a near-perfect repeat of Albert II's. The launch aboard a V-2 was successful, the flight into space was flawless, and valuable biomedical data was transmitted back to the ground. He reached an altitude of 130 kilometers, or 81 miles, and endured the journey without issue. But once again, the curse of the recovery system struck. The parachute failed, and Albert IV met the same violent end as his predecessor. It was becoming clear that the powerful but aging V-2 rockets were not the ideal vehicle for these delicate biological missions. They were complex, temperamental, and the program was running out of them. A new, more reliable American-designed rocket was needed. The answer was the Aerobee, a smaller, two-stage-sounding rocket that was simpler to operate and less prone to catastrophic failure. However, the switch in launch vehicle did little to change the tragic outcomes. In 1951, a monkey designated Albert V was launched aboard an Aerobee rocket. And once again, while the flight itself was a success, the parachutes on his recovery capsule failed, and he was lost on impact. Amidst this litany of death, there was one flickering glimmer of success that offered a path forward. On the 20th of September 1951, an Aerobee rocket carried a monkey named Yorick, who would posthumously be known as Albert VI, along with a crew of 11 mice. Yorick was not a rhesus monkey, but a cynomolgus macaque, a different species chosen for the experiment. The rocket boosted them to an altitude of 72 kilometers, or just under 45 miles. Not technically space by the Kármán line definition, but high enough to experience significant acceleration and a period of weightlessness. This time, miraculously, the parachute system worked. the capsule was recovered from the desert, and when the scientists opened the hatch, they found Yorick and the mice alive. For the first time, a primate had been launched to a significant altitude in a rocket and returned to Earth alive. The celebration, however, was short-lived. The recovery capsule had sat under the blazing New Mexico sun for 2 hours before the recovery team could reach it. Yorick died a few hours after landing, his death attributed to heat stress and the physiological shock of his ordeal. Although he did not survive for long, his mission was a crucial turning point. It proved that recovery was possible. The data gathered from all these flights, even the failed ones, was absolutely priceless. The telemetered readings of the Albert's heartbeats and breathing patterns during ascent and weightlessness provided the first concrete evidence that a primate body could indeed function in the extreme environment of a rocket launch and in the vacuum beyond. The problem was not a biological one, but a mechanical one. These monkeys, through their ultimate sacrifice, had taught the engineers of the fledgling American space program a hard but vital lesson. Getting into space was only half the challenge. Getting home was everything. While American engineers grappled with the challenge of a safe return, on the other side of the world, shrouded in the intense secrecy of the Cold War, another group of scientists was tackling the very same problem with a completely different philosophy. In the Soviet Union, the space program was a state secret of the highest order, its progress hidden behind the impenetrable veil of the Iron Curtain. At its helm was a figure known to his team only as the chief designer, a man whose true identity, Sergei Korolev, was so closely guarded that it would not be revealed to the world until after his death. Korolev, a brilliant engineer who had survived the horrors of Stalin's gulags, understood that the journey into space was a race, and he was determined to win it. He and his lead biomedical scientist, Vladimir Yazdovsky, made a pivotal decision that would forever distinguish their program from its American counterpart. They would not be sending monkeys into the cosmos. Instead, their pioneers would be dogs. This choice was not arbitrary. It was a calculated decision based on pragmatism and a deep understanding of animal temperament. Soviet scientists argued that primates, with their complex emotional states and nimble fingers, were too prone to panic and might interfere with the sensitive equipment inside a cramped capsule. Dogs, they believed, were more stoic. They could be trained to endure long periods of inactivity and were less likely to become distressed by the confinement and vibrations of a rocket launch. But the Soviets went a step further in their selection process, adding a layer of poignant symbolism to their cold, scientific calculations. They did not seek out purebreds from kennels or laboratory-raised animals. Instead, their recruits were gathered from the chilly, unforgiving streets of Moscow. They specifically chose mongrels, stray dogs who had spent their lives fending for themselves. Their reasoning was twofold. First, they believed these animals were inherently tougher A stray was already a survivor, accustomed to hunger, extreme temperatures, and the daily struggle for existence. This, they theorized, gave them a physiological and psychological resilience that a pampered animal would lack. Second, there was a sense of providing a grand purpose to a forgotten life. These were creatures with no name and no home, and they were being offered a chance to become heroes of the Soviet people. The selection criteria were incredibly specific and stringent. The canine candidates had to be small, weighing no more than 6 kilograms, roughly 13 pounds, and standing no taller than 35 centimeters, or about 14 inches. This was a physical necessity dictated by the tiny, pressurized compartments built for the R-1 rocket, a Soviet copy of the German 5.2. The scientists also preferred female dogs, not out of any perceived difference in temperament, but for a purely practical reason. The design of the sanitary devices and suits for collecting waste was simpler to engineer for their anatomy. Finally, the dogs had to be photogenic. They were to be light in color, ensuring they would show up clearly on the grainy black and white film cameras that would be their only companions inside the capsule. The Soviet leadership, even in these early, secret stages, understood the immense propaganda power of their endeavors. These dogs were not just test subjects, they were future icons. The animals selected were brought to the Institute of Aviation Medicine in Moscow, where they began a training regimen designed to methodically acclimate them to the alien and terrifying environment of spaceflight. They were housed in progressively smaller cages for periods stretching from days to weeks, conditioning them to accept the severe confinement of the capsule without panic. They were strapped into centrifuges that spun at high speed, subjecting them to the crushing G-forces of launch. They were placed on powerful vibration tables that simulated the violent shaking of the rocket engine, and they were blasted with loud noises to mimic the deafening roar they would experience. They were fitted with custom-tailored suits and clear bubble helmets, and they learned to eat a gelatinous, high-nutrient substance that could be easily dispensed in zero gravity. Throughout this process, the scientists, particularly Yazdovsky, developed a deep and genuine affection for their charges. They gave them affectionate names and treated them not as mere data points, but as fellow members of the mission. 2 dogs soon emerged as the prime candidates for the very first flight. A calm, dark, furred dog with white patches named Tsigan, whose name translates to gypsy, and a scrappy, light-colored terrier mix named Dezik. On the 22nd of July, 1951, long before the world had ever heard the word Sputnik, these 2 strays from Moscow stood ready at the remote and secret launch complex of Kapustin Yar, near the Volga River. They were carefully suited up and loaded into their capsule, a detachable nose cone atop an R-1A rocket. The mission was a vertical suborbital flight, a simple up and down trajectory designed to push them past the boundary of space and test their return. As the rocket thundered away from the launch pad, telemetry streamed back to the ground controllers, showing the dogs' heart rates doubling with the stress of the launch, just as the scientists had predicted. They soared to an altitude of 110 kilometers, about 68 miles, crossing the Kármán line and officially entering space. For several minutes, they experienced true weightlessness. Then, their capsule separated and began its descent. This was the moment of truth, the point of failure for so many of the American primate missions. A single, large parachute billowed open high above the Russian steppe. The capsule drifted down, landing softly as planned. The recovery team, with Sergei Korolev himself among them, raced to the landing site, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they opened the hatch, they were greeted by the sight of both Tsigan and Dezik, alive, unharmed, and happily wagging their tails. The tension on the steppe broke into a scene of pure jubilation. Men were shouting, hugging each other, and celebrating a monumental victory. Korolev, usually a stern and imposing figure, was seen joyfully running around the capsule, ecstatic that his canine cosmonauts had made it back. They had done it. They had successfully launched 2 animals into space and brought them home safely. Tsigan and Dezik were instant heroes. Tsigan was adopted by Anatoly Blagonravov, a prominent Soviet physicist, and lived out the rest of his days as a beloved pet, never to face the danger of a rocket again. Dezik's fate, however, served as a stark reminder of the perilous nature of this work. Just 1 week after his historic flight, he was launched again with a new partner, a dog named Lisa. This time, the parachute failed. Dezik, the veteran of the first successful flight, and the rookie Lisa perished in the crash. The Soviets, like the Americans, were learning that the sky demanded a heavy price for passage, but their initial, resounding success had given them a crucial early lead in the silent race to put a living being into orbit. This early Soviet lead, built upon the successful return of their suborbital dogs, created a palpable sense of momentum within the Kremlin. The chief designer, Sergei Korolev, had proven the reliability of his rocket and recovery systems. The next logical step, however, was a leap of an entirely different magnitude, to move beyond simply touching the edge of space and to achieve a stable orbit around the Earth. This was the true prize, a technological and ideological victory that would demonstrate the superiority of Soviet engineering to the entire world. The political pressure to achieve this goal was immense, and it reached a fever pitch in the autumn of 1957. On the 4th of October of that year, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik 1, a small, polished metal sphere that did little more than emit a repeating radio beep. Its impact, however, was seismic. That simple, lonely signal heard on radios across the globe was a proclamation of a new era. The Soviet Union was the first nation to place an artificial satellite into orbit. For the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, a man who understood the power of grand gestures. This was a moment of supreme triumph. Eager to capitalize on the global shockwave created by Sputnik 1, he saw an opportunity for an even more spectacular encore. The 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution was just a month away, on the 7th of November. Khrushchev summoned Korolev and gave him a new, almost impossible directive. Launch another spacecraft to commemorate the anniversary. And this time, it must carry a living passenger. Korolev and his team were given less than 4 weeks to design, build, and launch a completely new and far more complex vehicle. This brutal deadline carried with it a grim and unspoken certainty. While they had the technology to put a satellite into orbit, they had no system for returning one safely to Earth. There was no time to develop the necessary heat shields or recovery parachutes. The passenger on this celebratory flight, whoever it might be, was being sent on a one-way mission. They would be the first living being to orbit the planet, but they would also die in space. The search began for the dog who would carry this historic and tragic burden. From a pool of experienced canine trainees, the scientists narrowed the selection to 3 finalists: Albina, who had already flown on 2 suborbital missions; Mushka, who was used for testing instrumentation; and a gentle 2-year-old mongrel, part Siberian Laika, who had been found wandering the streets of Moscow. Her original name was Kudryavka, meaning Little Curly, but she would soon be known to the world by a different name, a name that would become synonymous with both pioneering spirit and sacrifice: Laika, a Russian word for barker. Vladimir Yazdovsky, the head of the biomedical team, ultimately chose Laika. She was calm, docile, and had an unusually patient temperament, qualities that would be essential for enduring the long and stressful ordeal ahead. The spacecraft being furiously assembled for her was Sputnik 2. It was a cone-shaped capsule, 4 meters, or about 13 feet high, and weighed over 500 kilograms, or 1,100 pounds, 6 times heavier than Sputnik 1. Inside, a tiny padded cabin was prepared, just large enough for Laika to stand or lie down. It was a marvel of miniaturized engineering, containing an oxygen generator to supply her with air, chemical panels to absorb carbon dioxide, and a cooling fan designed to activate if the cabin temperature exceeded 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit. She would be fed via an automated dispenser that provided a gelatinous, nutrient-rich substance. To prepare her for the mission, surgeons implanted sensors into her body to monitor her heartbeat, blood pressure, and breathing, and fitted her with a harness to keep her in place. The scientists knew her fate, and this knowledge cast a shadow over the preparations. In a quiet act of compassion, Vladimir Yazdovsky took Laika to his home the day before she was to be moved to the launch pad. He wanted her to have a few hours of normal life, to play with his children, to experience a moment of kindness before her final mission. he knew he was saying goodbye. At the Baikonur Cosmodrome, Laika was placed inside her capsule on the 31st of October, 3 days before the launch. The early winter on the Kazakh steppe was cold, and hoses from a ground heater were used to keep her small cabin warm. On the 3rd of November, 1957, the rocket carrying Sputnik 2 and its solitary passenger ignited. As it climbed into the sky, the ground controllers watched their telemetry in anxious silence. Laika's heart rate, normally around 70 beats per minute, had skyrocketed to 240 beats per minute during the violent, shuddering ascent. Her breathing was 4 times faster than normal. She was terrified, but she was alive. The spacecraft successfully reached orbit, and the world learned that the Soviet Union had done it again. Laika was circling the globe, the first living creature ever to do so. The initial Soviet press releases were triumphant. They reported that Laika was calm, that her vital signs were stable, and that she was doing well. They vaguely stated that she would be humanely euthanized after about a week in orbit. The world's reaction was a complex mixture of awe and profound distress. While the technological feat was undeniable, the thought of a lone dog dying in the cold emptiness of space sparked an international outcry. Animal welfare groups organized protests outside Soviet embassies. The ethical debate over using animals for scientific research erupted on a global scale. For decades, the official story from the Soviet government remained unchanged. Laika had survived for several days, providing valuable data before a peaceful death. It was a carefully constructed fiction designed to soften the harsh reality of her mission. The truth, when it was finally revealed in 2002 by Dr. Dmitry Malyshenkov, one of the scientists on the mission, was far more grim and heartbreaking. Laika did not live for a week. She did not even live for a full day. During the launch, a critical part of the spacecraft's thermal insulation had torn away. The carefully designed thermal control system failed to operate correctly. As Sputnik 2 settled into its orbit, the temperature inside Laika's tiny cabin began to climb relentlessly. The cooling fan was no match for the unfiltered heat of the sun's radiation. Within 5 to 7 hours of launching, after completing just 4 orbits, the temperature inside the capsule had soared to over 40 degrees Celsius, or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The telemetry that was supposed to provide valuable scientific data instead transmitted the final, frantic heartbeats of a small animal dying from overheating and panic. Laika perished not peacefully, but in distress, alone in a metal tomb that would continue to circle the Earth for 162 days. Her remains, encased within Sputnik 2, completed 2,570 orbits before the spacecraft finally fell from the sky, burning up like a shooting star upon re-entry into the atmosphere on the 14th of April, 1958. Laika's mission was a propaganda victory born from a political whim, but her sacrifice was not entirely in vain. She proved that a living organism could survive the launch into orbit and function in a state of weightlessness, a fact that was absolutely critical for the future of human spaceflight. Her tragic death also had a profound impact on the engineers themselves, forcing a new and urgent focus on developing reliable life support and, most importantly, re-entry systems. The next dogs sent into space by the Soviet Union would come back. Laika's lonely journey ensured that she would be the last one knowingly sent to her death. That solemn vow, forged in the aftermath of Laika's tragic flight, reshaped the entire Soviet space program. The focus shifted from pure spectacle to the complex, methodical engineering of survival. The chief designer, Sergei Korolev, knew that the next great leap, sending a human into orbit, was impossible without first mastering the art of the round trip. A new kind of spacecraft was required, one designed not just to be a platform for scientific instruments, but to be a lifeboat, a sanctuary capable of protecting its occupant from the two most lethal phases of any space mission: the fiery ascent and the even more perilous descent. The result was a revolutionary new vehicle, the Vostok. Unlike the simple single-piece Sputnik satellites, the Vostok was a sophisticated two-part craft. The main section was the instrument and service module, a cylindrical unit containing telemetry equipment, batteries, and the crucial retro rocket engine needed to initiate the return to Earth. Attached to its top was the part that truly mattered: the descent module, a spherical capsule just over 2 meters, or about 7 feet, in diameter. This sphere was a marvel of engineering, encased in a thick, ablative heat shield designed to flake and burn away during re-entry, carrying the cataclysmic heat of atmospheric friction with it. Inside, it contained a life support system, communications gear, and an ejection seat that would allow a future cosmonaut to bail out after re-entry and land separately by parachute. This was the machine that would bring the next generation of space dogs home. But the path to a successful return was fraught with peril, and the sky did not yield its secrets easily. The first attempt to launch a Vostok prototype, designated Korabl Sputnik 1, took place in May of 1960. It carried no living passengers, but a malfunction in its guidance system caused the retro rockets to fire in the wrong direction, pushing the spacecraft into a higher, useless orbit instead of bringing it home. The first test of the return vehicle had ended in a dismal failure. 2 months later, on the 28th of July, came a far greater tragedy. Another Vostok rocket was prepared for launch, this time carrying 2 dogs, Chaika and Lisichka, whose names meant seagull and little faw. They were beloved by the engineering team. Korolev himself was known to be especially fond of the gentle Lisichka. Just seconds after ignition, one of the booster's combustion chambers disintegrated. The rocket veered off course and exploded in a massive fireball just 23 seconds into its flight. Chaika and Lisichka were killed instantly. Their loss was a devastating blow to the team, a stark reminder of the violent energies they were trying to control. The pressure was now immense. After the global outcry over Laika, another public failure involving animal lives was unthinkable. The next mission had to work. For this pivotal flight, designated Korabl Sputnik 2, the scientists chose two new canine heroines, a confident white dog named Belka, or Squirrel, and her more timid, patchy-coated companion, Strelka, or Little Arrow. They, along with a backup dog named Zvezdochka, or Little Star, underwent the most intensive training regimen yet devised. They were subjected to long periods of isolation, high G forces on the centrifuge, and endless simulations inside a replica of their capsule. They were being prepared not just for a brief suborbital hop, but for a full day in the unforgiving environment of space. On the 19th of August, 1960, Belka and Strelka were carefully loaded into their spherical descent module. But they were not alone. This time, the Soviets were launching not just a pair of biological test subjects, but an entire ecosystem, a veritable Noah's Ark in miniature. Accompanying the two dogs was a gray rabbit, 42 mice, 2 rats, a collection of fruit flies, and several flasks containing pea plants, wheat seeds, and various species of fungi and microbes. The mission had a grander scientific purpose: to observe the effects of prolonged weightlessness and cosmic radiation on a wide variety of life forms. Bolted inside the capsule with them was another crucial piece of equipment: a television camera, which would, for the first time in history, broadcast live images of living creatures from orbit back to Earth. As the rocket thundered away from Baikonur, the world held its breath. The launch was flawless. Korabl Sputnik 2 entered a stable orbit, and soon the grainy, black and white images flickered to life on screens in the Soviet control center. There they were, Belka and Strelka, floating gently in the weightlessness of their cabin. At first, they seemed dazed, their bodies drifting in the zero-gravity environment. But soon, they began to adapt. The automated food and water dispensers worked perfectly, and the dogs were seen eating their gelatinous nutrient paste. For several orbits, the mission proceeded with textbook precision. Then, during the 4th pass around the planet, the controllers witnessed something alarming. Strelka, the more anxious of the two, became agitated. She began to bark and struggle against her harness, and then appeared to go into convulsions, her body twitching uncontrollably. She was experiencing a severe form of space sickness, a violent reaction of her vestibular system to the prolonged weightlessness. Belka, by contrast, remained perfectly calm and composed. This single, unexpected event had profound implications. The scientists realized that the transition to zero gravity could have unpredictable and potentially incapacitating effects. This observation directly led to the decision, made by Korolev himself, to limit the flight of the first human cosmonaut to a single orbit, just to be safe. After a harrowing few minutes, Strelka's episode subsided, and the mission continued. For a full day, the small ark circled the Earth, covering a distance of over 700,000 kilometers, or nearly 435,000 miles, as it completed 17 full orbits. Then, the command was sent from the ground to begin the journey home. The Vostok's retro rocket fired high above the coast of Africa, slowing the spacecraft just enough for Earth's gravity to capture it in its relentless grip. The spherical descent module separated from the service module and began its fiery plunge. Hitting the upper atmosphere at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour, or 17,500 miles per hour, the capsule became a man-made meteor. The ablative coating on the heat shield reached a temperature of over 1,500 degrees Celsius, close to 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, glowing brilliantly as it vaporized, carrying the deadly heat away. Inside, the animals were slammed by deceleration forces of up to 10 times the force of gravity. High above the Kazakh steppe, the main parachute deployed, slowing the sphere's descent. The recovery teams, circling in aircraft, spotted the capsule drifting down exactly in its target zone. They landed and raced to the site, their greatest fear being that they would find the occupants had been cooked alive or killed by the brutal impact forces. As they opened the hatch, they were met not with silence, but with the sound of barking. Belka and Strelka were alive. Not only were they alive, they were in remarkably good health. The other animals, the mice, rats, and insects, had also survived the ordeal. The plants showed no signs of damage. It was a perfect, unqualified triumph. They had done it. They had proven that a complex organism could be launched into orbit, endure the strange and disorienting conditions of prolonged spaceflight, and survive the violent inferno of re-entry. Belka and Strelka were instantly transformed from scientific subjects into global superstars. They were paraded before cameras at press conferences, two living, tail-wagging symbols of Soviet technological supremacy. Their journey was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. It gave the Soviet program the confidence it needed to take the ultimate step. A few months after her return, Strelka gave birth to a litter of healthy puppies. In a gesture of cosmic diplomacy, Premier Khrushchev presented one of these puppies, a fluffy female named Pushinka, to President John F. Kennedy's daughter, Caroline. Pushinka, a child of the cosmos, went on to live in the White House, a small, furry symbol of a space race that was now undeniably shifting in the Soviets' favor. The door to human space flight was now wide open, and the Americans were falling desperately behind. The chilling realization that a Soviet citizen, not an American, was now the most likely candidate to become the first human in space, rippled through the corridors of Washington, D.C., with the force of a political earthquake. The string of Soviet successes, from the beep of Sputnik 1 to the triumphant return of Belka and Strelka, had created a profound crisis of confidence in the United States. In response, a new civilian agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was forged from the embers of older military and research bodies in 1958. Its primary objective was clear: to catch up, and to do so quickly. The agency's first great endeavor was Project Mercury, a program with the explicit goal of putting a man into Earth orbit. But before they could risk a human life, they, like the Soviets, needed to be absolutely certain of the biological and psychological feasibility of the mission. They needed their own animal pioneers. The American scientists, however, held firm to their belief in the superiority of primates as human stand-ins. Their logic was different from that of their Soviet rivals. While the Soviets sought stoic endurance in their canine passengers, the Americans wanted to answer a more complex question. It wasn't enough to know if an astronaut could passively survive the journey. They needed to know if an astronaut could think, reason, and perform tasks in the alien environment of space. Could a pilot fly a spacecraft while weightless? Could they react to emergencies, read instruments, and make decisions? To answer this, they needed a creature with hands, a creature with a complex brain capable of being trained to do more than just endure. They needed a chimpanzee. Chimpanzees share approximately 98% of their DNA with humans, making them our closest living relatives. Their anatomy, their cardiovascular system, and their neurological responses are remarkably similar to our own. But it was their intelligence and dexterity that made them the ideal candidates for Project Mercury. At Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, a colony of chimpanzees was established, and a rigorous training program began. These were not to be passive occupants. They were to be active pilots. The core of their training revolved around a psychological principle known as operant conditioning. The chimps were taught to respond to specific light cues by pulling corresponding levers. A flashing blue light meant they had 5 seconds to pull a lever on their right. A white light signaled for a lever on their left. If they performed the task correctly and within the time limit, they were rewarded with a tasty banana pellet. If they failed, pulling the wrong lever or taking too long, they received a mild but unpleasant electric shock to the soles of their feet. This system of reward and punishment was designed to test their ability to concentrate and perform their duties under the extreme stresses of a rocket launch. From a pool of 40 chimpanzee candidates, a small, energetic 5-year-old, known officially as Number 65, emerged as the star pupil. He was quick, good-natured, and consistently performed his tasks with remarkable accuracy. Shortly before his mission, he was given a proper name: Ham. an acronym for the Holloman Aerospace Medical Center that had been his home and school. On the 31st of January, 1961, Ham was sealed inside a Mercury capsule bolted to the top of a Redstone rocket at Cape Canaveral, Florida. His mission, designated Mercury Redstone 2, was intended to be a simple suborbital arc, a 15-minute flight that would mimic the one planned for America's first astronaut, Alan Shepard. But from the moment of launch, things began to go wrong. The Redstone rocket, a descendant of the V2, proved to be too powerful. It burned for longer than planned, accelerating far faster than expected. Instead of a gentle arc, Ham's capsule was boosted like a cannonball into the sky. He was subjected to crushing G-forces of nearly 15 times the force of gravity, far more than anticipated. He was flung to an altitude of 253 kilometers, or about 157 miles, nearly 100 kilometers higher than planned. He traveled at a speed of over 9,600 kilometers per hour, roughly 5,800 miles per hour, significantly faster than the mission profile had called for. The flight was a terrifying, out-of-control ride. On the ground, mission controllers watched in horror as their projections showed the capsule would land far downrange in the Atlantic Ocean, well outside the primary recovery zone. Yet, inside that wildly off-course capsule, a small, furry pilot was calmly doing his job. The telemetry streamed back to Earth, showing the flashing lights of his console and the movements of his hands. Despite the punishing acceleration and a longer than expected period of weightlessness, lasting nearly 7 minutes, Ham pulled his levers with near-perfect timing. He made only one error, a testament to his incredible focus under conditions that would have disoriented a human pilot. He was proving, in real time, that it was possible to think and work through the chaos of a space launch. After his violent ascent, Ham's capsule plunged back into the atmosphere and splashed down in the Atlantic. 212 kilometers, or 132 miles, from the nearest recovery ship. The force of the impact had damaged the capsule's heat shield, and it began to take on water. For hours, the capsule bobbed in the waves, slowly filling with seawater. When the recovery helicopter finally arrived and hoisted the capsule from the ocean, they found Ham alive and remarkably calm, having suffered nothing more than a bruised nose. He was famously photographed after his ordeal, sitting on the deck of the recovery ship, accepting an apple and a half orange from his handlers. Ham's flight was a spectacular success born from a near disaster. It gave NASA the final piece of data they needed. And just over 3 months later, Alan Shepard followed Ham's path, becoming the first American in space. But the larger goal, an orbital flight, still lay ahead, a feat the Soviets had already accomplished with Yuri Gagarin. To test the Mercury capsule's endurance for a multi-orbit mission, NASA turned to another chimpanzee, a larger, more aggressive male named Enos. Enos's training was even more complex than Ham's. In addition to the light and lever tasks, he was also taught to perform more complicated sequences, including a series of tasks that, if he failed, would result in the temporary loss of his ability to earn banana pellets or avoid the electric shocks. This was a direct test of a human's ability to handle complex system management over a long duration. On the 29th of November, 1961, Enos was launched into orbit aboard a powerful Atlas rocket for a planned 3-orbit mission, a full dress rehearsal for John Glenn's upcoming flight. Once in orbit, problems began to mount. A malfunctioning thruster caused the capsule to constantly drift and wobble, wasting precious fuel. Far more seriously, for Enos, a short circuit in the wiring of his console caused the system to go haywire. The machine began to punish him with electric shocks even when he pulled the correct levers. Despite this confusing and painful malfunction, Enos persevered. He continued to work, pulling the right levers at the right time, enduring 76 unwarranted shocks before mission controllers, seeing both the spacecraft's instability and the torment their pilot was enduring, made the decision to cut the flight short. After completing 2 orbits, they brought him home. His capsule splashed down in the Atlantic, and he was recovered, greeting his rescuers with an angry snarl, a clear display of his displeasure with the faulty equipment. His frustrating, painful journey was nonetheless another vital success. Ham had proven a pilot could work during a short, violent flight. Enos had proven that an astronaut could function for hours in orbit, could endure equipment malfunctions, and could maintain focus over a long and arduous mission. They were not just passengers. They were aviators. Together, they had answered the critical questions, clearing the final hurdles, and giving America the confidence to finally send its own hero, John Glenn, into orbit around the Earth. With the superpowers now locked in a headlong race to the moon, the use of animals in space began to diversify, branching out from the headline-grabbing missions of dogs and primates. The 1960s saw a new wave of spacefaring nations emerge, each eager to establish their own scientific credentials and carve out a niche in the celestial frontier. This led to an explosion in the variety of species sent beyond the atmosphere, as scientists sought to understand the effects of space travel on a wider range of biological systems. The expanding arc of cosmic voyagers now included creatures great and small, from insects and amphibians to the first, and to this day, only feline astronaut. This unique chapter in space history was written by France. While the Americans and Soviets focused on orbital mechanics and human spaceflight, the French space program, operating out of a launch facility in the Algerian Sahara, concentrated on upper atmospheric research using their Veronique-sounding rockets. Their biological subjects of choice were cats, selected for their highly sensitive vestibular systems, the complex set of organs in the inner ear that control balance. Scientists wanted to study how this delicate system reacted to weightlessness and a cat's legendary ability to always land on its feet made it a fascinating subject. The French scientists acquired 14 cats from a pet dealer and began a rigorous training program similar to that of the dogs and chimpanzees, including centrifuge rides and confinement in small containers. They even surgically implanted electrodes into the cats' skulls to monitor their neurological activity during flight. From this pool of trainees, a small, good-natured black and white female cat, a stray found on the streets of Paris and designated C341, was chosen for the mission. On the 18th of October, 1963, she was strapped into her capsule atop a Veronique AGI rocket and launched from the Hammaguir launch base. The flight was a suborbital arc, lasting just under 15 minutes. The rocket carried her to an altitude of 157 kilometers, or about 98 miles, providing her with 5 minutes of true weightlessness. Throughout the flight, the electrodes in her brain transmitted a constant stream of neurological data back to the ground. After reaching the apex of her trajectory, the capsule separated and deployed its parachute, drifting back down to the desert, where recovery teams quickly retrieved it. C341 was alive and well. After the flight, she was given a new, more fitting name, Félicette. She became an instant celebrity, a symbol of French technological prowess. Her mission provided valuable data on how a complex mammalian brain reacts to the absence of gravity. But her ultimate fate was a somber one. 2 months after her historic flight, she was euthanized so that scientists could perform a necropsy and examine her brain for any changes caused by her journey into space. Félicette remains the first and only cat to have ever traveled to space. Her brief, pioneering flight, a unique footnote in the annals of astronautics. While France was sending felines into the sky, the Soviet Union, despite its focus on human missions, was quietly pushing the boundaries of deep space exploration with a different kind of animal. As the race to the moon intensified, Soviet engineers were developing the Zond program, a series of spacecraft designed to test the technologies needed for a crewed lunar mission. The Zond spacecraft was a stripped-down version of the crewed Soyuz vehicle, and its purpose was to fly around the moon and return to Earth. Before they could risk sending a cosmonaut on this perilous, week-long journey, they needed to understand the biological effects of traveling through deep space, far beyond the protective magnetic field of the Earth. In this region, known as the Van Allen belts, levels of solar and cosmic radiation are significantly higher. Would this radiation be lethal to a complex organism? To find out, the Soviets once again turned to a creature known for its hardiness and longevity, the tortoise. On the 15th of September, 1968, the Zond 5 spacecraft was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. On board, sealed within the descent module, were 2 Russian tortoises. They were not alone. Accompanying them on their lunar journey was a diverse collection of fellow travelers: wine flies, mealworms, plants, seeds, and various bacteria. The tortoises were the primary subjects, chosen because their slow metabolism and ability to survive for long periods without food or water made them ideal for a long-duration mission. Their shells also offered a degree of natural radiation shielding. The Zond 5 mission was a spectacular success. The spacecraft swung around the far side of the moon, taking breathtaking photographs of the lunar surface and becoming the first vehicle to circle the moon and begin a return trajectory to Earth. The plan was for it to splash down in the Indian Ocean, where a recovery fleet was waiting. A guidance system failure during the final approach, however, sent the capsule on a ballistic re-entry path, subjecting its occupants to brutal deceleration. Forces of up to 20 times the force of gravity before it finally splashed down. Despite the rough landing, the tortoises survived. They were recovered and flown back to Moscow, where scientists studied them intensely. They had lost about 10% of their body weight, but they were active, had good appetites, and showed no signs of radiation sickness. They had become the first living beings to travel to the vicinity of the moon and return safely to Earth, a feat they accomplished months before the crew of Apollo 8 would make their own historic lunar orbit. The Soviets had once again beaten the Americans to a significant deep space milestone, proving that the radiation environment between the Earth and the Moon was survivable. The space arc continued to grow ever more diverse. China, a late entrant to the space race, launched a biological satellite in 1990 containing guinea pigs. The Japanese sent newts into orbit to study the effects of microgravity on vertebrate development. But perhaps the most surprising and scientifically revealing passengers were some of the smallest. In the 1970s, as part of a high school student experiment that flew aboard the Skylab space station, two common cross spiders named Anita and Arabella were sent into orbit. The question the student wanted to answer was simple. Could a spider spin a web in zero gravity? The first day, the spiders seemed disoriented, spinning chaotic, useless strands of silk. But by the third day, something remarkable happened. They had adapted. Arabella spun a beautiful, symmetrical orb web, just as she would have on Earth. It was a stunning demonstration of an organism's ability to adapt its innate behaviors to a completely alien environment. Anita and Arabella, along with Félicette and the Zond tortoises, proved that the biological questions being asked were becoming more subtle and more profound. The era of simply testing for survival was over. The new goal was to understand how life itself, in all its varied and wonderful forms, could learn to make a home in the vast and silent emptiness of space. The apocryphal story of the space spider's web marked a significant turning point in the use of animals in space, signaling a transition from pioneering flights of survivability to methodical, long-term scientific inquiry. The focus was no longer on simply keeping a creature alive through the trauma of launch and re-entry, but on understanding the subtle, creeping changes that the unique environment of space inflicts upon living tissue over weeks, months, or even years. This new era of research was made possible by the advent of the world's first true orbital laboratories, the Soviet Salyut stations and the American Skylab. These were no longer cramped, automated capsules, but relatively spacious habitats where human crews could live and work for extended periods. They were also the perfect platforms for conducting sophisticated biological experiments. For the Soviet Union, this new phase was embodied by the Bion program, a series of dedicated, unmanned biosatellites launched between 1973 and 1996. These spacecraft were essentially automated, orbiting laboratories, each carrying a diverse menagerie of life forms on missions lasting up to 2 weeks. The primary passengers on many of these flights were rhesus monkeys. Unlike the brief, suborbital flights of their American predecessors, Ham and Enos, these Soviet monkeys were subjects in a far more comprehensive study of the long-term physiological effects of space flight. 2 monkeys, Abrek and Bion, flew the first mission, Bion 6, in 1983. They were followed by Verney and Gordy on Bion 7, Drioma and Yerosha on Bion 8, and Zirconia and Zabiaka on Bion 9. Each pair was launched into orbit and carefully monitored, with an array of sensors tracking every aspect of their physiology. Scientists studied changes in their cardiovascular systems, the loss of calcium in their bones, the atrophy of their muscles, and the subtle shifts in their circadian rhythms. After their return to Earth, the monkeys underwent extensive further study, providing a wealth of data that was directly applicable to the health and safety of human cosmonauts spending months aboard the Mir space station. The Bion program wasn't limited to primates. It also carried a vast array of other organisms, from rats and geckos to fish and newts, each chosen to answer a specific scientific question. Pregnant rats were flown to study the effects of microgravity on mammalian embryonic development. Newts were chosen because of their remarkable regenerative abilities. Scientists would amputate a limb before flight and study how the limb regrew in the absence of gravity, providing insights into cellular repair mechanisms. Fish were used to study the vestibular system, as their swimming behavior provided a clear visual indicator of their orientation and balance in a weightless environment. These missions, often conducted in collaboration with American and European space agencies, created a massive shared database of biological knowledge, a foundational text for the emerging field of space medicine. Across the ideological divide, NASA was pursuing similar research, though with a different methodology. Instead of dedicated unmanned satellites, the Americans utilized the unique capabilities of the space shuttle. The shuttle's large payload bay could carry a fully equipped pressurized laboratory module called Spacelab right into orbit. This allowed astronauts, who were often trained scientists and physicians themselves, to conduct hands-on experiments in a laboratory environment, a significant advantage over the automated systems of the Bion satellites. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, dozens of shuttle missions carried biological experiments. Space Lab missions studied the effects of microgravity on everything from the immune response of rats to the fertilization of sea urchin eggs. They flew crickets to study their nervous system development and jellyfish to observe how their gravity-sensing organs, which are surprisingly similar to those in the human inner ear, adapted to weightlessness. One particularly compelling series of experiments involved pregnant mice. Scientists found that mice conceived and born in space, while initially showing some disorientation, quickly adapted to their three-dimensional world, learning to push off surfaces to move around their habitat. This research was crucial for understanding whether future generations of humans could be born and raised in off-world colonies, a staple of science fiction that was now being subjected to rigorous scientific scrutiny. The culmination of all this research, the grand synthesis of the Soviet Bion program and the American Space Lab missions, is the International Space Station, or ISS. Orbiting the Earth at an altitude of over 400 kilometers, or roughly 250 miles, the ISS is the largest and most complex orbiting laboratory ever built. From its very inception, it was designed to be a world-class facility for long-duration biological research. Inside its various modules, astronauts from around the world conduct experiments on a dizzying array of organisms. The Japanese experiment module, Kibo, has housed an aquatic habitat where generations of Medica fish have been born and raised in space, allowing scientists to study the entire life cycle of a vertebrate in a zero-gravity environment. The European Columbus module has hosted experiments on spiders, studying their predatory behavior and web weaving in microgravity, a direct descendant of the Skylab experiment decades earlier. The station's labs are filled with rodents, both mice and rats, living in specially designed habitats. These mouse-tronauts are critical for studying the long-term effects of space on mammalian physiology, from bone density loss and muscle atrophy to changes in the gut microbiome and the aging process. Because a mouse's lifespan is so much shorter than a human's, scientists can observe the effects of a lifetime in space in just a couple of years, providing invaluable insights into the health risks that long-duration missions to Mars or beyond will pose to human astronauts. From the first fruit flies launched on a captured V-2 rocket to the complex ecosystems thriving aboard the International Space Station, the journey has been a long and transformative one. The questions have evolved from a simple, fearful, "Can we survive?" to a far more profound, "How does life itself change when removed from the planet of its birth?" The orbital laboratories, teeming with their silent, non-human crews, have become the crucibles where we are forging the knowledge needed not just to visit other worlds, but one day, perhaps, to live there. From the first tentative pulse of life sent shivering into the unknown aboard a repurposed weapon of war. The story of animals in space is the story of our own cosmic genesis. It began not with a grand human leap, but with the humble fruit fly, whose survival in 1947 aboard a V-2 rocket answered the most fundamental question of all. The void was not instantly lethal. This single discovery opened the floodgates of possibility, leading to the heartbreaking but invaluable missions of the Albert monkeys in America. Their fleeting heartbeats, transmitted from the edge of space, proved that a mammal could endure the journey, even if the engineering of the time could not yet guarantee a safe return. Across the world, the Soviet Union pursued the same goal with a different kind of pioneer, the resilient street dogs of Moscow. The triumphant recovery of Tsigan and Dezik from their suborbital flight was a landmark victory, a success that was soon followed by the poignant, lonely orbit of Laika. Her one-way mission aboard Sputnik 2, a sacrifice that stirred the conscience of the world, proved that orbiting the Earth was survivable, and made the development of a return vehicle an absolute moral and technical imperative. That imperative was met with the incredible journey of Belka and Strelka, whose safe return after 17 orbits was the final, definitive proof that the path was clear for humanity. While the dogs proved endurance, the American chimpanzees, Ham and Enos, proved that an astronaut could also be a pilot. Their ability to perform complex tasks amidst the chaos of launch and the confusion of equipment malfunctions demonstrated that the human mind could function in space, a critical step that paved the way for the Mercury astronauts. In the decades that followed, the spacefaring arc expanded to include an extraordinary diversity of life, from Félicette, the only cat to see the Earth from above, to the stoic tortoises of Zonde 5, the first living beings to circle the moon and return. With the dawn of orbiting laboratories like Skylab and the International Space Station, the mission evolved from pioneering survival to profound scientific inquiry. The generations of mice, fish, newts, and spiders studied in orbit have helped us understand the deep, subtle ways that life adapts to the absence of gravity, providing the essential knowledge needed to keep human explorers safe on long journeys to Mars and beyond. Every human who has ever floated in weightlessness, every astronaut who has looked back at the pale blue dot of our world owes their journey to this silent, non-human crew. They were not merely subjects in an experiment. They were the first explorers, the true pioneers whose sacrifices and triumphs wrote the first chapters of our species' journey to the stars. Their legacy is etched into the very fabric of human spaceflight, a constant reminder that our grandest ambitions have always been carried forward on the small shoulders of the creatures with whom we share our planet.